In the late 15th century, amidst the cultural shifts and legal complexities of the Dutch Republic, Katherina Deg Grebber was born into a respectable family on the outskirts of Leiden. Born in 1496, she lived in a society deeply rooted in traditional values, where a family's honor held more weight than an individual's freedom or happiness. Her early life was typical for a middle-class girl. She helped with household chores, learned domestic skills, and awaited the future her family would plan for her. This future, however, would be violently disrupted by a man named Garrett Vanrahorst. In September of the year 1510, while traveling near Leiden, Katherina was abducted by Vanrahorst, a man who had methodically planned the crime. He wasn't a stranger. He had studied Katherina's family for weeks, learning their routines and vulnerabilities. When he found her alone and in a defenseless position, he kidnapped her and took her to the small town of Sassenheim. There, he kept her hidden and under constant coercion. During her 4-month disappearance, Katherina endured severe psychological trauma and physical constraints. Her abduction was not just an act of lust or madness, it was a calculated strategy. Vanrahorst forced Katherina into a sham marriage ceremony, hoping to legitimize his actions in the eyes of the law and society. This so-called marriage was a grotesque mockery of consent. In the legal framework of the 16th century, once a woman was married, her identity and rights were subsumed under her husband's. In Katherina's case, this meant that she was legally considered Vanrahorst's property. He used the institution of marriage to transform a victim into a possession. Her family, meanwhile, was thrown into turmoil. They knew their daughter had been taken but had no idea where she was or whether she was even alive. The search for her was frantic, but without any clues, the weeks turned into months. In the societal context of the time, Katherina's disappearance also threatened her family's reputation. A young woman gone missing under mysterious circumstances could be viewed with suspicion, and shame could easily be heaped upon victims rather than perpetrators. For Katherina, the months in captivity were a descent into despair. Every day under Vanrahorst's control chipped away at her spirit. She had no legal rights, no voice, and no pathway to justice. In the eyes of the law, she had become a wife. In reality, she was a prisoner. Finally, after 4 long months, Katherina managed to escape or was recovered. Sources vary, but she returned to her family changed, scarred, and haunted. The vibrant, cheerful girl they had known had. When Katherina Deg Grebber returned home after 4 grueling months of captivity, her community was both shocked and conflicted. Her physical presence was proof of survival, but the emotional and psychological toll was harder to quantify. The once lively and confident girl now spoke in hushed tones, her gaze often distant. Her family was overjoyed at her return, but quickly realized that her ordeal was far from over. In the 16th century Dutch legal system, women had limited autonomy, especially in matters involving marriage. Since Vanrahorst had conducted a forced marriage ceremony, the burden now shifted to the courts to determine whether the union was valid. The legal structure of the time was woefully inadequate in distinguishing consent from coercion, and Katherina's case became a battleground not only for justice but for the recognition of a woman's right to say no. Katherina's family hired legal counsel and took the matter to the local court. They presented evidence that the marriage was conducted under duress and that Katherina had been abducted against her will. Witnesses were brought forward, including townsfolk from Sassenheim who had seen her in a frightened, subdued state. But Vanrahorst, well aware of how to manipulate the system, claimed that Katherina had consented. He argued that they had eloped in secret and that the marriage was real and legitimate. He even produced forged documents and statements from 2 witnesses, likely bribed or coerced, to strengthen his claim. The courtroom became a theater of power dynamics, where a man's word held more credibility than a traumatized woman's truth. For weeks, the trial dragged on. Katherina had to relive her trauma again and again as she recounted her abduction and abuse before male judges who often looked upon her with skepticism. The very idea that a woman might have agency to reject a marriage was still controversial. But through the persistence of her family, the growing support of sympathetic clergy, and the testimony of villagers who contradicted Vanrahorst's story, cracks began to form in his version of events. In a rare moment of justice for the time, the court finally ruled in Katherina's favor. They condemned Vanrahorst for abduction and unlawful coercion and sentenced him to imprisonment. However, the victory was bittersweet. The court stopped short of immediately annulling the forced marriage. In the legal tangle of that period, a marriage, even one born of violence, was difficult to dissolve without approval from ecclesiastical authorities. Katherina's family had to petition the church separately, a process that could take months or even years. So, while Vanrahorst sat in prison, Katherina remained legally bound to him. She could not remarry, reclaim property rights, or fully move on. It was a cruel irony. Though the world saw her as a victim vindicated, she was still shackled by the same law that had failed to protect her in the first place. Even more painful was the stigma that clung to her like a shadow. Some in her community whispered that she had somehow invited her fate, that perhaps she had been involved with Vanrahorst willingly and regretted it later. Such malicious gossip reflected the deep-rooted misogyny of the era, where a woman's virtue was fragile and her trauma easily dismissed. Katherina bore not just the wounds of her captor, but also those inflicted by a society that refused to acknowledge her as a full human being with rights, voice, and value. Her struggle was not just personal. It was symbolic of the battle women faced across Europe in an era where law and morality often diverged. Yet, Katherina did not retreat into silence. Her experience lit a fire within her. She began speaking at small gatherings, particularly with women in her community, warning them about the dangers of forced unions and advocating for reform in marriage laws. It was radical for her time, but Katherina's voice began to ripple through the social fabric. With the help of her father and a few progressive thinkers, she contributed to a petition sent to the authorities in Leiden, urging them to reconsider the rights of women in marital matters. It was not immediately successful, but it planted seeds of change. Katherina had turned her suffering into a mission, one that would echo far beyond her own life. The long-term impact of Katherina's case extended well beyond the courtroom and into the heart of 16th-century Dutch society. While she would never fully escape the emotional scars left by her abduction and forced marriage, she began to shape a legacy that challenged the status quo. After nearly 2 years of relentless petitions and appeals to the ecclesiastical court, the forced marriage was finally annulled. The church acknowledged that a sacrament performed under coercion held no divine legitimacy. It was a rare, groundbreaking decision that gave Katherina her legal identity back and allowed her to live as a free woman. She was no longer Vanrahorst's wife. She was Katherina again. Freed from the legal bonds of her abuser, Katherina committed herself to education and community work. She collaborated with local scholars and clergy who supported the idea of reform. Her case began to circulate in writings and debates across cities like The Hague, Utrecht, and Amsterdam, where early humanist thinkers began advocating for better protections for women. In some circles, her ordeal was even cited as a moral lesson, a warning against unchecked patriarchal power and a call for legal reform. Katherina became a quiet symbol of resistance. Not loud, not revolutionary in the way history often demands, but persistent, wise, and courageous. By the late 1520s, the Dutch Republic saw the beginning of modest shifts in the way marriages were handled legally. While full consent laws wouldn't be codified until much later, Katherina's case contributed to the gradual recognition of forced marriage as a violation of personal and divine law. Some towns began requiring that 2 independent witnesses confirm a woman's voluntary consent to marriage. In schools for girls, usually run by nuns or wealthy patrons, Katherina's story became an example used to teach caution, strength, and the importance of speaking out. Katherina never remarried. Whether by choice or circumstance, she lived the rest of her life quietly in Leiden, surrounded by those who loved her and believed in her story. She opened a small school for girls, where she taught reading, moral philosophy, and domestic skills. not to reinforce submission, but to prepare young women to survive and protect their dignity in a world still hostile to their independence. Many of her pupils would go on to share what they had learned, and some even recorded her teachings and life events in journals, fragments of which survive today. When Katherina passed away in 1553 at the age of 57, she left behind no children, no famous husband, no grand estate. But she left something far more valuable. A ripple of awareness in a society just beginning to understand the importance of consent, justice, and the autonomy of women. Her story was preserved in legal records, family letters, and oral traditions. In time, her name came to represent not only a victim of violence, but a pioneer in the fight for women's legal recognition. In the centuries that followed, Dutch historians occasionally revisited her case during discussions of women's rights. By the 19th century, Katherina Deg Grebber was mentioned in feminist writings as one of the silent heroines, whose suffering forced society to confront its moral blind spots. Today, her story continues to resonate, not just as a historical account of tragedy and survival, but as a timeless reminder of how even the most brutal injustice can give rise to a quiet revolution. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.